Welcome to our webinar today on caring for Gen Z in a post-pandemic world. We are so glad that you've joined us today. On behalf of the Office of Youth Ministry, wanted to say a warm welcome to you wherever you find yourself on the East Coast, West Coast, wherever you might be today. And so we're looking specifically at those that are 13 to 25 years old. Our time today will be about an hour with our partners from Springtide Research. So it's going to be about our implications for us as faith leaders as we work on this ministry thing together. We will have a time for question and answer, probably the last 15 minutes or so. And we will also be recording this session, as you see, and everybody who has registered for this will receive a copy of that after we get it uploaded and all the things. So as an introduction, my name is Chris Bjorky, and I serve as the Interim Program Manager for Youth Ministry at the ELCA Churchwide Office. And as you saw in our announcements, we had a QR code where you can just link into there. And in our link tree, we have different things from our Faith Formation Office, from children, youth, and young adults, as well as our partners with the ELCA Youth Ministry Network. And speaking of partners, I'd like to share some information by introducing my colleague, Todd Bugler.
With that, let me add my word of welcome to all of you to this event. We're very excited about this opportunity that we have both to gather and to learn things together. And I want to actually as well just add my word of thanks to the ELCA team, to Chris and to Brooke and to Justin, who did a lot of the heavy lifting on putting this event together. Thanks to all of you for your work as well. Just a quick word about the network. We gather as a community in lots of different ways, in person and online, to provide opportunities for renewal and for education and for support for us in the ministry that we do. So I'm just really glad that all of you are here today. We do this thing called the Extravaganza every year. It's coming up in just a few weeks. We got a crowd of folks coming to Anaheim. We're really excited about that. Yes, you can still slide into that if you haven't had the opportunity to sign up yet, either in person or online. The event will all be done online as well. And we're super excited. The website is ext23.org. It's going to be, like I said, in Anaheim at the beginning of February. Beyond that, there are other things coming up. Oasis, which is a different webinar series that we do as well with some learning, and it's really geared more towards volunteers. It happens in the evenings. We encourage you to bring lots of folks from your congregations to that. The next one is coming up in April as well. And then Connect Journal and Third Tuesday Conversations, our podcast, and lots of things like that. So we encourage you to go to our website, elcaymnet.org, and discover the resources that you can access there that will help you in the ministry that you do. I've been asked to pray for our event, pray for our time together here. So let's begin with a word of prayer. The Lord be with you. God of grace, you draw us together regardless of distance into a community that serves young people and their families and that learns together about ways to do this holy work. Bless us as we discover more about the young people you call us to serve and how they navigate a world that is in constant change around them and around us. Bless us in our conversations today. Bless us in our wisdom, and bless us in our ministries. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, I'm going to toss it over to our friends, Kevin and Nabil from Springtide Research, who are going to take the lead and walk us through the things that they've learned. So Kevin and Nabil, go for it. Let us know what you've learned and discovered.
Hi, great to be with you today.
Hey, everybody. So good to be with you. My name is Kevin Singer. I'm head of media and public relations for Springtide Research Institute, and I'll allow my colleague to introduce herself.
I'm Nabils Background, and I am the Senior Research Associate at Springtide Research Institute, and I'm delighted to be here. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us. You know, I've got 4 kids under the age of 10, so depending on how you look at it, this is going really, really spectacular if you think about it. So good to be with you. We as Springtide are so passionate about flourishing in the lives of young people. I know we don't talk about young people and flourishing very often in the same sentence. We tend to think about them struggling and maybe getting into some habits and other things that we're maybe a little nervous about. But I know that there are so many people in this call that care deeply about young people and their faith and their flourishing. And we're here to be cheerleaders for you. As you think about, what does it look like to love young people, to walk in step with young people, to guide them and to gain their trust in a post-pandemic world. So thank you again for having us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if that's all right. I've got a nice little presentation for us just to help everybody follow along. I know that with these webinars, sometimes you can kind of, your eyes sort of glaze over. And so hopefully, what you'll gain from this is you'll walk away with a lot more confidence as you engage youth in your ministry. I hope that sounds good. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hopefully everybody can see that. Let me see how to slideshow from the beginning. Look at that. Awesome. Woo! So I'll talk just a little bit briefly about, how I come to this space, and Nabil, you're invited to share the same. So my career really started out in college ministry, and partly because I was just a year removed from college. So that is kind of how my career got kicked off. I have taught religion courses at community colleges for the last 10 years. Where I get to delve into all sorts of fun topics about religion and diversity and faith with young people between the ages of 18 and 22, usually. And I also co-direct an organization that seeks to bring Christians and Muslims together called Neighborly Faith. And so I've got tons of experience working with young people and getting to know them and getting to see them walk through their faith journey. So that's a little bit about my background. Nabil, what would you say really brings you to this work?
Yeah, sure. So I am a sociologist by training, and I work at the intersection of race and ethnicity and religion, and some of the ways that young people express religion and how that might vary across racial and ethnic groups. And throughout the past 10 years, I've been teaching and writing and speaking at this intersection. And so it's been really great to focus even more so on young people and some of the trends we're seeing at the national levels, especially post and pre-pandemic, and being able to track those trends and relay them to the people who care for young people in order to help them care better. So relaying those national trends is kind of how I fit into the puzzle at Springtide.
Awesome. Okay, so Springtide Research Institute, we conduct qualitative and quantitative research, which essentially means we interview young people and we survey them. And why do we interview them? Well, it brings a little bit more context and a little bit more color to what they're telling us on surveys. If you're in this room and you're survey skeptical, we get that, we see that, and that is why we interview young people, because we want to know, are these national trends and data really telling the full story? What's unique and specific about our research is we look at a broad range of young people that are typically known probably to you as Generation Z or Gen Z. So that would be those who are ages 13 to 25. Now, as young people grow and get older, we will then turn to the next generation and so on. But our goal, our mission is to help those caring for young people to care better. We believe that young people shouldn't have to answer life's biggest questions alone. I don't know about you, but when I was young, mentorship and guidance from older adults that did not come in the form of clean your room was scarce. So even as I've grown up, and now I'm in my 30s, I now recognize how golden those people were in my life who invested in me. And ultimately, I think if you walk out of this room and the only thing you take away is, I need to pay more attention to the lives of young people in my life, that would have been a victory for us. I think what often happens is young people feel unseen. They feel invisible. They don't feel like their concerns or their struggles are really taken seriously. And so what we want to do is we want to say they are here. And I mean, I just heard a sermon at my church on Sunday from my pastor, who said a lot of times we think about young people as the church of tomorrow, but really they are the church of today. And so we need to take that really seriously. These are people who, how we steward their lives and their concerns has a big impact on the future of our denominations, the future of the church. Now, when we think of a post-pandemic world, we think of a world that just came out of 2 years essentially of trauma, right? 2 to 3 years of our entire lives being defined by upheaval and uncertainty. And because we're all walking together out of that really difficult season, especially young people whose lives were totally thrown off course, we need to begin exploring how might we do youth ministry and how might we approach young people differently now that we are in 2023 as opposed to 2019. I'm going to have Nabil jump in here, but one of the reasons why we were invited here is because our research institute has done a lot of good work on young people in the pandemic already. So Nabil, you want to jump in and tell them a little bit about some of our reports?
Sure, yeah, I'd be happy to, Kevin. So at Springtide Research Institute, we have conducted 2 studies, really directly focusing on young people's experiences of the pandemic. Every year we conduct a really large, nationally representative survey. And the topics for that kind of vary across years, but we really wanted to keep our eye on how the pandemic was changing things, if at all. And so the first study we conducted was the new normal. And we did this in February of 2021. We had the opportunity to survey over 2,000 young people and interview about 24 young people to follow up with some of the information we found in that survey. And then this past year, we wanted to follow up and see if any of those trends that we started tracking in 2021 remained in place a year later. So that's what we did. We got the chance to ask a lot of the same questions and track any changes in that, as well as ask some new ones that have popped up that the people that we work with had been increasingly asking about how to move forward and care for Gen Z 2 years out from the outset of the pandemic. So that was the new normal updated and expanded, and we collected an additional almost 2,000 survey responses from that and interviewed another dozen young people. And yeah, Kevin, I'll kind of throw it back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nabil. I think hopefully what this shows is we're really committed to understanding young people in this moment. Because I think a lot of people, when you look at a lot of other research institutes and survey administration, really what people seem to want to know most about is how many young people are still going to church, right? Which is a really important question and something that is worth our time to look at. I think what is missing a lot of times is actually getting to know young people's thoughts, their perspectives, what they're experiencing on the ground. And that's what we really hope to accomplish through our research. Okay, so maybe you're here and you agree with this. After COVID-19, we can't go really back to normal, but instead prepare for a new normal. And essentially, to put this differently, I think for a lot of us, we want comfort and familiarity, but the world simply has changed, especially for young people who, just a few examples here. Imagine a high schooler who was used to being involved in all sorts of different ways, who missed out on performing in theater, band, competing in sports, formative experiences rooted in skill building and socializing that can't be made up for. Or a recent graduate who had clear plans and who suddenly faced uncertainty and scarce jobs. Or young people of all ages who lost loved ones, lost jobs, or watched parents lose jobs. I mean, it's one thing to go through this, I think, as adults who have maybe become accustomed to a certain level of uncertainty, suffering, and loss. But for young people who were experiencing a level of familiarity and consistency at a very critical time of development in their lives, it wasn't just that the pandemic introduced a new challenge. It was like a brazen and sudden left turn. I really think Patty, age 25, gets this right on the head. I feel like there's not a lot of acknowledgement of how the pandemic impacted young people. Here's a few other quotes. Of course, we really prioritize the voices of young people in our research. This is Jess Gage, 20. She says, when COVID hit, I was a senior in high school and was really excited, but then it felt like it all got ripped out of my hands. All of the important parts of my life were taken away. When you hear people talk about their senior year, you think of graduation, senior prom, and all these fun things that I was not able to get. And finally, this is Kristin, age 15. I feel like before COVID, I was a different person. Quarantine was the first time I was actually truly alone with my thoughts. It brought this loneliness that I still feel right now, even though I'm back in person school. And anyone here who's working with young people knows this is a generation that is isolated. This is a generation that is lonely. This is a generation that is not growing up at a time where relying on the community is as popular. These are digital natives who a lot of times are seeking community in digital space. Now those relationships can be transformative, not just transactional. But the truth remains that when we poll young people again and again, they tell us they're lonely and they're isolated. And that is a key realization of young people that should help to guide our approach to them in this new post-pandemic landscape. Now, of course, I know a lot of people here are in the ministry, either in a lay role or in a formal role. And so there are three really key activities that we are finding to be critical when it comes to what it means to care for young people now. The first is rebuilding trust. I say this all the time, but it feels like building trust is sort of a lost art. We, especially older people, we tend to think that trust is built by an impressive pedigree or impressive role or title. That maybe the degrees we've earned or the professional or life experience we've had should be enough to help us gain trust with young people. But now young people trust people who care for them. They trust people who invest in them. They trust people who have FaceTime with them or remember things about their lives, who really care to listen to their suffering and their struggles. That is how trust is now built with a new generation. The second is understanding where young people are at. And the third is exercising empathy. And of course, empathy means being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes and to really understand what they might be going through. I'm going to explore each of these quickly, again, with the hope that you would maybe look at your current ministry or what you're currently working on and think, how could I inject these emphases, inject these practices into what I'm currently passionate about, what I'm currently working on. When it comes to rebuilding trust, I thought this quote was really telling, and I'm hoping you do too. So this is from Shonda, age 24. She says, I feel like COVID-19 really showed people what their values are. You can see people who were more selfish and kind of didn't really have much regard for the welfare of others. I think there was something about COVID-19 and the pandemic experience that really revealed, I think, institutions, it revealed leaders, it revealed everyday people. How do they show up in the world when things are hard or uncertain or tough, or when there's lots of regulations or restrictions, right? It really showed, who we say we are and whether that's actually true. I don't have this statistic in the presentation, but I think it is so startling. I want everybody to listen in right now when I say this. Only 10% of young people that we surveyed said that a faith leader personally reached out to them during the pandemic. I'm going to say that again. Only 10% of young people who completed our survey said that a faith leader reached personally out to them during the 2 years of the pandemic that we surveyed. That is a startling number, right? What that means is that 90% of young people had zero contact with a faith leader during the pandemic, at least a faith leader who was willing to reach out personally. What that suggests is that we may be at a critical juncture where we are either showing up intentionally in the lives of young people, or we may actually be expecting young people to come to us. And that for sure may be an assumption that we need to reevaluate in a post-pandemic world. Understanding where young people are at. Look at this statistic. I think this is so telling. Nearly 8 in 10 young people agree, I am more likely to listen to adults in my life if I know that they care about me. It seems so simple, right? But it's actually something that if we're not careful, we just forget how important, how critical it is. That it is impossible to gain trust with someone if you're not willing to listen to them, if you're not willing to sit with them and spend devoted quality time getting to know them. So understanding where they're at and really demonstrating that understanding is key. Finally, exercising empathy. This quote, not going to lie, was very convicting to me. This comes straight from our report. Let's go back. The new normal. Young people will look to you as a model for how to feel safe, grieve, celebrate, resist comparison, and more. If you're struggling to do these things yourself, you'll struggle to extend those things to a young person navigating them for the first time. You know, part of empathy, what we've learned in our research, is transparency. What we find a lot is that older adults that approach young people aren't necessarily prepared to be vulnerable about how they themselves are experiencing emotions like grief, celebration, the feeling of safety or a lack thereof. And again, it really is this antiquated idea that if we impress young people with our role or experience or pedigree, they may trust us or listen to us. But what we're finding is empathy begins with us ourselves being honest about how we personally struggled during the pandemic years. Think about how when you go forward in your ministry to young people, how you might inject transparency and vulnerability into your interactions with them. Now we're going to get even more practical and talk about a couple of really important ways that we can care for Gen Z in a post-pandemic world. The first, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is creating safety. I was raised by baby boomers, and this simply was not in our vocabulary for me and my brothers, right? Like the importance of, if you don't feel safe, you can't actually process difficult emotions. If you can't feel safe, you can't actually think about whether you've been in survival mode for 3 years, right? And so safety is such a critical question when it comes to helping young people to process the trauma of the upheaval and uncertainty they've faced over the last few years. So 74% of our survey respondents said they hope to feel safe again when the pandemic is over, suggesting that for years, they didn't feel safe enough to really process their emotions from their experience. Secondly, creating safety is about helping a young person move from fight, flight, or freeze to, in our language, breathe and be. I wonder how transformative it would be for you to ask young people under your care whether they feel like they're in survival mode, and for how long they feel like they've been in survival mode, and how you can help them to exit survival mode, process difficult emotions they've had over the last few years, and learn how to lean into healing. I wonder how critical that conversation might be with you and young people. Now, we did ask young people what spaces they felt most safe in during the pandemic. You'll see church was down at 18%, with school being 29%. The point of this graph is not to compare school and church, but to say safety was not a strongly used term that young people would use to describe their pandemic experience. The second thing is celebrating what's been gained without insisting on optimism. So I thought this was interesting. 57% of our survey respondents said, when the pandemic is over, I expect that a lot will be different in mostly disappointing ways. So I think young people are maybe taking cues from us as leaders. The pandemic was really hard, it was really difficult. And while those things are true, I also wonder if there's an opportunity for us as leaders to be honest and transparent about the ways the pandemic may have contributed positively to our lives. For example, did you pick up any new spiritual practices while you were in lockdown, for example? I know for me, my prayer life grew significantly. I really am not taking for granted as much the relationships that I had prior to the pandemic, right? There's these opportunities, I think, and we would all agree, as we live a life, as Peter says, that we shouldn't be surprised if we suffer, right? Like, what are the opportunities we had during that time to be sanctified, to be growing in our faith? And how can we pass that wisdom along so that young people are not only conceptualizing of the pandemic as a time of loss, like none of it could have possibly meant anything positive. And third, taking care of the body to help the body and the mind process stress. So someone who I'm dating right now has a teenage daughter, and her teenage daughter was really struggling to like get out of bed in the morning and go to school, was facing a lot of feelings of depression. Everything changed when she enrolled her daughter in a local gymnastics class, because it was simply that her daughter was moving her body every single day, and just the value that played in her life. And that has not just paid dividends in her physical and mental health, but also in her spiritual health. There's something that is frankly spiritual about daily wellness routine and having the opportunity to just find that release. I think that is a critical piece of helping young people to heal in a post-pandemic world, is thinking, how can we introduce opportunities for them to be healthy physically and mentally? So walks, deep breaths, decreasing sugar and caffeine intake, drinking more water are all simple but effective ways to care for the body during an uncertain time. Just a few more interesting data points. I don't want to talk much longer. That's not really my style. I want this to be more conversational. So as we come to a close on our talking at you part of the conversation, I'm going to share just some data points that I hope that those of you who are here find really interesting. So maybe this surprises you, maybe it doesn't, but during the pandemic, more young people actually grew in their faith than those who say their faith became weaker or lost their faith altogether. So you'll notice 30% of young people say their faith actually became stronger during the pandemic. Definitely approach young people in their life and ask them, how do you feel like your faith was affected by the pandemic? Because you might find that some young people will say, my faith flourished, or my faith grew significantly. Those are really interesting conversations to have. However, and this is a major trend in Springtide Research, Gen Z continues to remain a bit distant from religious institutions, churches, and faith communities. So even though their faith is growing, it isn't necessarily growing in tandem with their participation in a faith community. So a quarter of young people say their relationship with faith leaders became weaker has becoming weaker since the pandemic. I know that for a lot of people here, you are literally seeing this in your day-to-day ministry, your day-to-day life. Young people maybe care about spirituality, they care about spiritual things, but there's some sort of a disconnect between the programs and the context of religious life at your church and how they themselves are engaging or are using their curiosity when it comes to spirituality. And probably the thing that I know might burst the bubble of some people here, the answer to this isn't necessarily creating digital church or offering digital church. So only 10% of young people say they found joy in virtual religious gatherings during the pandemic, which of course is a really low number. Actually, the most popular pandemic practice that young people want to keep doing is cooking more, while virtual church is what people least want to keep. Now, what does that say? What sorts of conclusions can we draw from that? Well, I think the first thing is, when young people think about fulfilling purpose and finding happiness in their life, they're not equating that with participation in a service. It seems like what they are equating that with is something they can do that's tactile, something they can do that they can see the payoff, they see the final product. Maybe cooking is something that they're doing in community. Maybe they're doing it with their parents or grandparents or siblings or friends. And of course, for young people who direly need relationship and closeness to other people, cooking may have that element, whereas they're not necessarily finding that same sense of belonging through a virtual church service. We asked them whether a totally online religious community can meet all their spiritual needs. As you'll see, by a wide margin, the majority say they disagree that an online religious community can meet all their needs. I know for me, like, a typical band-aid that I'm finding, not just among faith leaders, but business leaders and others, they really feel like if they can just digitalize everything they do, young people will automatically be involved or have a high level of trust for it. But as it turns out, though they do engage in social media at a high rate, when it comes to meaningful spiritual experience, it's not being found through digital means. Finally, despite disinterest in religious services, virtual or otherwise, young people maintain or added spiritual practices of their own. This is what we found to be the most challenging point for faith leaders normally, is that young people are religious and they are spiritual. In fact, in our last national survey, over 70% of young people identified themselves as religious or spiritual. Keep that in mind. If you were in a room of 100 young people, according to our survey, over 70 of them would raise their hand if you were to say, do you consider yourselves a religious or spiritual? Now, that totally goes against a lot of popular surveys that say that young people are leaving religion in droves, right? So our data says something very different from that. Now, here's the caveat, though. They are religious and they are spiritual, but not in ways we have come to expect. So what does that mean? Well, look at this question. Look at the results of this question. Which of the following new practices do you engage in regularly? Notice what you'll see. Prayer, of course, is something that we all understand to be prototypical of Christians. But what about meditation, reading, being in nature, yoga, martial arts, and art? Are those the kind of things that you are introducing to young people as vital means by which they can connect with God? You might think about ways that you can incorporate these practices into your programs or into your church life. Young people might say, wow, I really feel like they are seeing me in terms of how I'm connecting spiritually. And now finally, and this is obviously a serious topic, but when Nabil and I and others in our organization hear from people who ask us about how they can help young people flourish, especially faith leaders, most of the time what we hear about is how can I keep them from the brink of a mental health disaster, right? So that is a very common question that we get from people. And this should be no surprise, but mental health was absolutely the area that young people struggled with the most during the pandemic and even coming out of the pandemic. So in 2022, 47% of young people told us that they are moderately or extremely depressed. That is obviously epidemic numbers. And Vivek Murthy, who is the Surgeon General of the United States, has put out a report essentially declaring the mental health crisis among teens as an emergency, as a national emergency. And it is absolutely critical that we take this very seriously. But the statistic on the left is really the one that I think we ought to focus on, and that is 61% of young people agree the adults in my life don't truly know how much I am struggling with my mental health. Again, this is such a critical juncture in this presentation for those of you. If you've checked out a little bit, I get it, but focus on this slide for a second. If I were to ask you this question, have you broached mental health with young people in your congregation or young people in your youth group? If you haven't, why not? And perhaps think about, how can I incorporate mental health as an area of teaching, as an area of focus, as an area of discipleship in my ministry? Because here's the thing, if 47% of young people are saying they're depressed, that means potentially half the young people involved in your congregation would say they're depressed. Now, again, if you are depressed and you're focusing on your health, if not your own survival, it's not likely that you're going to have the emotional or spiritual capacities to focus on spiritual growth. And so that is a key place where, by investing in the lives of young people and their mental health, you could be preparing them for a flourishing spiritual life. Now, the cool thing is, the fortunate thing is, young people seem to notice that religious and spiritual activities matter for their mental health. So for young people of faith, a majority would agree, my religious and spiritual life has an impact on my mental health. Or 73% said it affects their mental health positively. What would it look like for you in your ministry with young people today to ask them to sit down, journal, reflect, pray, about how their spiritual life affects even to be serious, their will to live or their sense of purpose in life. What would it look like for you to actually broach that topic? What would it look like for you to be vulnerable and transparent about your own mental health? I can tell you right now, if you were to be transparent with young people in your life about your own mental health, that would create and promote a conversation that could potentially be transformative with young people. This is such a great quote. I really hope after the pandemic, the conversations about mental health change dramatically, because I think now people are starting to realize that you don't have to be mentally ill to struggle with your mental health. A lot of people never developed coping strategies to deal with their mental health because they weren't mentally ill, and now they're having to do that. Maybe that includes some of you in this space right now. Seriously consider what it might look like for you to broach that topic. Now, obviously, we need to say that mental health is something that it's a multifaceted approach, and faith leaders should not put themselves in the position of being a psychiatrist in that way. But I do think that faith leaders have the opportunity to guide young people as they explore the relationship between spirituality and mental health in their lives. This is the thing that we really want to build you up with, and that is that faith leaders and communities have a really important role to play. I think a lot of times faith leaders count themselves out. They say young people are leaving the church in droves. Young people don't want to come to my program. They don't want to come to my camp. They don't want to come to, and so there's this internal narrative that young people just don't care about religion. They don't care about church, but that's just simply untrue. I think what is a more positive way to conceptualize that is that young people desperately want their churches to understand them and to hear them and to understand their new spiritual practices, their struggles with mental health. They want to be seen in those ways. So I just put these in here right before the presentation, actually, as things that I think could really be transformative. So if you want to like screenshot this slide and bring this to your leadership team next week and say, hey, I went to this presentation, here's some ways they said that we could help young people in our congregation, this would be a great opportunity to do that. The first thing is providing young people with opportunities to process the stress of the pandemic years. Do you feel like you're in survival mode? How can I help? I really do truly think that could provide a really fertile conversation for change and growth. The second, consider inviting a psychologist or a psychiatrist to come chat with your group to offer practical advice about addressing mental health concerns as a way to open up this conversation. Especially if they're a psychiatrist or a psychologist of faith, maybe there's someone who's in your congregation, maybe they're an elder or a deacon or a small group leader. That could be a really powerful way to open up the conversation among young people. And then third, reimagine your ministry by incorporating their new practices and the things they missed most during the pandemic. So I actually wrote this down and I wanted to share this with you. Young people told us that the things they miss most are contact with friends, eating in restaurants, and traveling. I wonder what it would look like for your youth ministry to incorporate those even very basic things more. Eating together at restaurants, traveling together. But for sure, young people need connection with older adults. Our research has shown consistently that the more older adults that young people trust, the more that those older adults are in their lives, the more they feel like their life has purpose. So don't count yourself out. You are a critical piece of the flourishing of young people. So a couple of things before we jump into a time of Q&A and dialogue. We would love to keep in touch with you and continue to resource you and be an encouragement to you. We have a bi-weekly newsletter that you can sign up for at Springtide Research that will keep you up to date on all of our reports, all of our comings and goings all over the country when we talk to young people. Please connect with us on social media. That would include Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where we tell the stories of young people. We tell you where we're in the media and in the news. And please tell us if you have a really great story about how you saw a young person's life change or how you contributed to a positive change in a young person's life. Go ahead and send us a note at stories@springtideresearch.org. We have an entire landing page dedicated to our resources for young people in the pandemic. You could Google Springtide Research Pandemic, or you could copy this URL. And every year we release a State of Religion and Young People. And that's usually in about October of every year. And that is a very substantial report that basically gives you an update on where young people are when it comes to their faith. This past year in 2022, our report was on mental health. So obviously, as we've talked about in this call, it's a critical part of what we do. And we also distribute guides to turn the tide. So if you are part of a leadership team at your church that talks about how to care best for young people, or if you're a youth group leader and you have a team, working through that guide to turn the tide could be a really, really helpful resource for you as you think about how do we tackle mental health among young people in our congregation. And of course, if you want to get a hold of us, here are our email addresses. We'd love to hear from you and provide different resources that we can offer or connect you to people who we know can be a resource to you. And of course, we'd love to hear from you. I may have gone a little long, and I apologize for that, but we would love to answer any questions that are had. And before we do that, though, Nabil, I wanted to know if there's anything from the presentation that was impressionable to you or really stands out to you as something that is an important contribution of our research to faith leaders.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. One of the things I just wanted to underscore that Kevin mentioned is this bit about listening. This is something that we've just encountered time and time again, and there are ways of listening well, and young people are really attuned to what those practices for listening well are. Probably the piece of advice that I give the most to people that is drawn from our qualitative data, right, that is evidence-based, is that affirmation is such an important component to the listening process. There is a tendency, I think, for us as adults who care about young people to immediately jump into problem-solving mode. That's what we do when we care about people. We want to solve their problems. And just time and time again, the component that young people see as most important in that listening process is genuinely stopping, pausing, listening. And it's so powerful to just stop and say, I hear you're concerned about X. I can see why you're concerned about X. That is a legitimate thing that I would be concerned about too. And I just want to sit in that space with you. So just wanted to add that little kind of evidence-based piece in there too, to Kevin's fantastic presentation.
Yeah, Nabil, that's such great thoughts. Again, it's the lost art of how important relationship is when it comes to influencing young people. Yeah, it's young people continue to report to us that they really just wish adults would take the time to listen. So thanks for emphasizing that. So I think we're entering into a time of Q&A. I'm going to pull up the Q&A here. And as I think Brooke said, please submit your questions. Nabil, I'm gonna have you answer some of these, perhaps.
Sure, yeah, I'm seeing some questions about.
So if you see anything, Nabil, that really stands out to you that you want to answer, go for it.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can answer some of the questions about our research methods I'm seeing, and I'm seeing a question about the difference between church and spiritual gatherings. So I'm happy to answer those. The question about the difference between church and spiritual gatherings, sometimes for the purposes of presentation, we condense down what we actually ask in the surveys. And so that is a really great question to clarify what it is that young people were distinguishing from there. And so in the survey itself, young people were asked about attendance, church attendance, Sunday services, and collective services or gatherings outside of church walls. That were not necessarily held on Sundays, right? So these were things like spiritual retreats, or maybe even Bible readings online, Bible studies online, things like that. And so we were seeing these big differences in attendance in traditional within the walls type of gatherings and services and ones outside of the walls. As far as our research with our demographics, so every year we collect about 10,000 survey responses for our annual State of Religion and Young People. All of the surveys we do, even including the smaller ones like the new normal that you saw presented here today, are nationally representative. And what that means is that we match all of the demographics of the survey with larger national demographic trends. So while we sample, obviously we don't sample everyone in the US, our sample reflects the percentages of demographic variations you see in the broader US, right? So an example of that is if the US is 60% female, we would see 60% female in the sample that we study. And we match those demographics on race, location, and gender. We survey young people from all religious affiliations and no religious affiliations at all. So we see a really great variation in the way that people are thinking about religion, experiencing it, expressing it, practicing it. And we definitely include those non-religious voices as well.
Thanks, Nabil. I'm seeing questions about whether there's been success around mental health. Yes, we do see that among congregations. Typically what we find is that congregations that have success around adopting or stewarding mental health are those that do so from a peer, by empowering young people to talk about and to be vulnerable about mental health with their peers. So I think while it's important for faith leaders to bestow the mental health conversation with young people during maybe like a highly programatized event, think about also using a resource like Mental Health First Aid. So Mental Health First Aid and other programs like it help to empower young people themselves to help other young people with their mental health. So that is something to think about. Again, Mental Health First Aid. I know that I've talked to multiple people who say their congregations really benefited from it. Again, with the major difference being instead of one leader or two leaders being conscious and sensitive to the mental health of young people, these programs help to empower young people themselves to be conscious and sensitive to their mental health together. So I'll just say that. The other thing I'm seeing a lot about is safety. I think it's fair to say that safety is a result of there being safe people in a space. It may be worth thinking about whether you yourself have really thought about and discerned, like, am I a safe person for young people? Are there opportunities for me to grow? Are there conversations I can be having with young people where I can gauge how safe they feel in this space? Getting feedback from young people on that, I think, is really critical. The other thing I'll say too about safety is we find that young people feel most safe around older people that they feel like they can relate to. So again, not to beat a dead horse, but going back to this really critical piece about transparency and vulnerability. So, and that is where empathy is found, right? So in order for a young person to feel like they can talk to you about a certain struggle in their life, they need to know that that is a struggle that is not beneath you or something you would never possibly think about, right? I think sometimes a lot of young people look at faith leaders and think they probably can't relate. But the truth is, so many people, 172 people on this call right now, so many of you can relate to feelings of hopelessness, can relate to temptation, right? Can relate to navigating difficult relationships. The question in my mind is whether or not you're willing to share that with them. And if you're willing to share that with them, I think you'll find that you will be empowering and promoting more feelings of safety in your space. Again, think about people that you feel are safe in your life. If I had to guess, they're people that you feel like you can relate to, people who wouldn't be shocked or disappointed if you were to share what you're going through. Recently, I got into a conversation with a friend of mine who has a teenager, and they told me that their teenager's really into anime. And I know a lot of young people are into anime and crystals and things like that right now, and that's a whole other conversation. But what my friend told me is, I had never watched anime or thought about anime, but when I sat down with my son and started watching anime with him, all of a sudden I became a safe person. That was literally their exact words. So think about maybe how sharing in their passions, sharing in the things that they love or things that they're interested in might also create a sense of safety in their relationship with you, but also their relationship with the congregation. Just a thought though. I don't know if we have any more time, but I saw a bunch of questions related to that. Do you see any others, Nabil, that you want to tackle? I don't know if we're out of time, so please interrupt us if we are. But
yeah, I think maybe we could take one more question and then pass it back to Kimberly. Let's see. I'm seeing a lot of kind of the same themes, Kevin, that you covered. Can you say anything about how to balance placing, wanting to interact with young people and having to balance that with all of the different things that are going on in their lives? And then maybe we can toss it over to Kimberly after that.
Right, such a great question. Young people are obviously pulled in a lot of directions, have a lot of goals, and part of a lot of activities, right? So this is such a big conversation, but I'll just say this. We can no longer rely on a model of reaching young people that requires them always to come to us or to walk through our doors. I think there needs to be a new reevaluation of what it means to enter spaces where young people are at without expecting them always to come into our space. I don't necessarily see a really strong future where our space continues to be the town square of young people in their spiritual lives. I think, again, what does it mean, to use a metaphor that I've just used, what does it mean to watch anime with a young person in your life? Maybe it's not anime and maybe it's not a teenager, but what does it mean to attend a sports event with a college student and be part of that experience with them? I recently saw a quote by Josh Allen, who's the quarterback of the Buffalo Bills. Of course, there were some really unfortunate events that took place last week in the NFL. But what's amazing is when the Buffalo Bills came back from that, on the very first play of the next game, there was a kickoff return for a touchdown. And this was so impressionable to me, but Josh Allen said when that happened, it was spiritual, was the word he used. So obviously, young people are willing to think about spirituality outside the walls of the church in a way that maybe we're not familiar with. So what would it look like to be with a young person in a space where they're watching a miraculous kick return for a touchdown, and that for them is spiritual? What does it look like for you to occupy that space with them? I think there's some good, fertile conversation that needs to be had there when it comes to what it means to continue reaching them in this moment. All right, it's 2:00. We're gonna turn it over.
I will say too that we had a lot of really excellent questions, and I did see a couple more questions on methods, and I'm really happy to answer those questions if you want to shoot me an email. But just the one that I saw about urban versus rural respondents, the respondents in our survey are also proportionate to the variation in the broader United States of urban versus rural persons.
Well, I want to say thank you to all of you who have taken time out today to join this conversation, a really helpful conversation. As a veteran youth director and director of youth ministry for one of our ELCA synods, I appreciate a lot of this. And I appreciate the question regarding urban and communities of color, because youth ministry does look different in different settings. So I thank you for paying attention to that. Kevin, what you said about anime, I tell youth, I started being an anime back in the early 80s as a kid in junior high. So I'm an old anime head to this stuff. So that's an icebreaker right there. It makes you feel like you have something you can relate to. So thank you for those kind of things, and cooking and football or whatever it might be. I want to thank Chris, our ELCA program manager for youth ministry, for the brainchild of creating this lunch and learn. Thank you very much. What a wonderful idea and what a wonderful response. Thank you, Kevin, Nabil, and others whose names I missed. I do apologize. I thank you for your work, your research, and your love of this work, and everyone at Springtide Research. Thank you to Brooke, who was helping with organizing this and has been troubleshooting for us today to get us together and a lot of troubleshooting. For those of you who have joined this conversation, I just want to say your work with children, youth, and young adults is precious. You need to know that even when you are feeling discouraged or not certain, you are being prayed for in rooms you cannot imagine. So I want you to hear these words of encouragement from Paul's letter to the Ephesians. This is from the 3rd chapter, starting at the 14th verse. For this reason, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name. I pray that according to the riches of God's glory, you may be granted strength in your inner being with power through God's Spirit, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, so that you may be filled with all the fullness of God. And now unto God, who by the power at work within us is able to accomplish abundantly far more than we can all ask or imagine. To God be glory in the church and in Christ Jesus to all generations forever and ever. Amen. Let us pray. Holy and mighty God, who has brought us thus far on the way, we ask your blessing on each presenter and organizer for this conversation. We thank you for their love and care for your church, and especially for young people. Encourage young people so that they may know your deep love for them. May we love them as fully as you have designed them to be. May we be transformed by them. And guide us, God, always as we strive to join you in your just future for all. In the precious name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Thank you so much for coming. Have a great rest of your day.